seatbelt sign had gone out by the time Mrs. Rawlings paused for breath, and Elizabeth took ruthless advantage. "Excuse me, the seatbelt sign is off. I want to—" "It takes some people that way," said Mrs. Hector Rawlings. Apparently it did. There was a wait. Elizabeth didn't mind. Her chief aim was to escape Mrs. Rawlings, and once she was out of sound of that nasal voice, her excitement returned. Here she was, on her way at last. If only she could have gotten a window seat. For most of the trip there would be nothing visible outside except darkness, but she could have turned her back on her fellow passengers and reveled in the glorious daydreams that had been 3 years in the making. The line moved forward. The man ahead of Elizabeth shot back his sleeve and consulted his watch, one of those elaborate affairs that measures every aspect of life that can be reduced to mathematical terms. Elizabeth smiled to herself. Some people couldn't stop rushing, even when there was nothing to rush toward. Her eyes wandered on to the person who was now first in line, and her smile turned to a critical frown. Being only 7 years away from her own teens, she had, for that age group, the intolerance characteristic of reformed alcoholics and former smokers toward those still suffering from the vice in question. Why, she wondered, did American teenagers have to look so messy? This girl's face was turned away, but the youthful roundness of her body betrayed her age. The said body was covered, but not entirely concealed, by a garment of Indian gauze printed in hideous shades of lilac, blue, and magenta with touches of gold. It billowed madly down and out from her shoulders, and was gathered in around her plump waist by a raveling piece of rope. The girl's most outstanding characteristic was her hair, an inchoate mass of tangled curls, whose color was— no, some peculiarity of the cabin lights must be responsible. Green hair? One of the lavatory doors opened, emitting a weary-looking woman carrying a fat, red-faced baby, whose pursed lips made it look like W.C. Fields was preparing to make a scathing comment about babies. The teenager made a smart left turn and disappeared into the lavatory. Elizabeth's knees sagged. She caught the back of the seat next to her for support. The profile had been visible for only a fleeting instant, but it was unmistakable. The noble Roman nose, the firm lips clamped shut over what had seemed, in certain photographs, a quite impossible number of teeth. That was no teenager. That was Margaret Rosenberg. If her native United States had awarded such honors, she would long since have been Dame Margaret. She did have 2 titles, neither of which she chose to use. Her doctorate was in the field of medieval studies, on which subject she had written several books that managed to combine impeccable scholarship and exquisite style in an almost unprecedented manner. As the widow of a distinguished Scandinavian diplomat, she was properly Countess Rosenberg. Scholar, feminist, and historian, she was also the top-selling novelist on the list of Elizabeth's publishers. Elizabeth knew these facts and many more, just as she knew every feature of that homely but aristocratic face. Margaret Rosenberg had been her ideal ever since she had written Tower of Faith, which contributed to Margaret's winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1969. She had used every method short of assassination to get the job with Frenchin and Monk, because Margaret Rosenberg was on their list. She had attained the job, but not the meeting she had dreamed of. Margaret never came to New York, and when it was necessary for her publisher to consult with her, Mr. Monk himself made the trip to Connecticut bearing gifts, not boxes of chocolates or flowers, but trinkets from Tiffany. These were not so much offerings to scholarship as an investment in future profits. In addition to her non-fiction writing, Margaret turned out a biennial historical novel that zoomed consistently to the top of the bestseller list, trailing all the longed-for subsidiary rights that gladden a publisher's heart and increase his bank account. Frenchin and Monk waxed fat and decidedly had no kick with Margaret Rosenberg. "Oh, God," Elizabeth prayed, "let her come out of that one before I go in the other one. I'll think of something to say. Something cool and calm and witty and wonderful." Of course, it didn't work out that way. It never does. Elizabeth's only consolation was that by the time her turn came around, she had failed to think of a suitable remark. "Hey, aren't you Margaret Rosenberg?" hardly seemed to meet the standard demanded by such a momentous occasion. When she emerged, the author was nowhere in sight. Elizabeth did not return to her seat but prowled the aisle, eyes darting from side to side. The bizarre green hair should have stood out like a stoplight or go light, but the seat backs were high and the chubby figure had been short, much shorter than Elizabeth had expected. She was finally halted in her quest by the juggernaut advance of the drinks cart. She had to retreat, but a last desperate glance located her quarry several rows ahead. Yes, it was. It was Margaret. She looked like nothing on this earth or any other planet, but there was no doubt as to her identity. When Elizabeth sat down, Mrs. Rawlings wondered audibly what she was doing, wandering up and down like that. Elizabeth heard her only as a buzzing in the background. She was planning her strategy. This was karma, kismet, fate. She and Margaret were destined to meet, but perhaps Buddha or God or Allah helped only those who helped themselves. It was up to her to make the most of this heaven-sent opportunity. As soon as the cart cleared the aisle, Elizabeth was up, abandoning Mrs. Rawlings in the middle of a description of her most recent operation, gallbladder. The reconnoiter was carried out with care for fear of alarming the quarry. Margaret was notoriously shy of publicity. That was why Elizabeth had never been able to meet her. The author was in the center of the 3 seats on the left side of the plane. Elizabeth knew why she was not traveling first class. Had she herself not written the publicity handout that described Margaret Rosenberg as extravagantly generous with needy friends and worthy causes, but reluctant to spend money on her own comfort? Spectacles riding low on her nose, Margaret was bent forward in absorbed perusal of a copy of Mad magazine. There could be no mistake. Its format was as defiantly recognizable as was its reader. In the window seat was a young woman wearing glasses, a demure expression, and a drip-dry navy suit. That was all that could be said about the suit or its wearer. The occupant of the aisle seat was male, blonde, and not bad-looking, if Elizabeth had been interested in that point, which she was not. It required no great stretch of the imagination to identify him as Margaret's son, whose existence was acknowledged, but not enlarged upon, in her biographical notices. The 2 profiles were comically alike. The outlines of the noses might have been double images of the same prominent object. Christian Rosenberg's lips were set tightly, and the quirk of humor that warmed Margaret's face was conspicuously lacking in his. Maybe he's afraid of flying, Elizabeth thought patronizingly. He ought to be used to it by now. He and his mother were always crossing one ocean or another. He was half Danish and probably had relatives there, though he had been raised in America after his father died 20 years before. The date was a matter of public record and therefore known to Elizabeth. Her imagination insisted on viewing Count Theodore's death as a romantic tragedy, though she had nothing to base this impression on except his relative youth and the fact that Margaret had never remarried. Elizabeth returned to her seat. Mrs. Rawlings' medical confidences flowed on unheard as she considered her next move. She decided to try the obvious one first and departed again while Mrs. Rawlings was describing her sister's accouchement. 30 hours in labor, honey. Can you believe that fool of a doctor? And then after all, she had to have... The big question was whether the young woman in the window seat belonged to Margaret's party. She could be a secretary or a companion, or even Christian's wife. However, the latest biographical handout had not mentioned a daughter-in-law. A fiancée, perhaps? If so, Elizabeth's first ploy was probably doomed to failure. No harm in trying, though. Passing Christian's seat, she swayed and reached out for support. It was not unreasonable to suppose that a staggering passer-by might miss the back of the seat and rest a dainty hand on the occupant's shoulder. The fact that the plane was absolutely steady at that moment would, she hoped, escape Christian's attention. He looked up when she touched him. His eyebrows were several shades darker than his corn-yellow hair. They rushed together in a formidable frown. "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth cooed. "I'm not used to the motion of the plane." "Sit down, then," Christian said. He returned to his newspaper. Elizabeth scuttled back to her seat, pursued by cabin attendants bearing trays. "Say, you sure are nervous," Mrs. Rawlings said disapprovingly. "If you'd sit still, you'd feel a lot better. I was going to tell you about my son having shingles." Elizabeth was tired of Mrs. Rawlings. "I can't sit still," she said. "I have